In a world where money can buy everything, one man believed a horse was nothing more than an investment. When his legendary Mustang was injured, he discarded it like broken equipment in the freezing woods of Wyoming. But fate had other plans. A poor girl living alone by the creek saw what he never could, a heart still beating beneath the dust of defeat. It was a late September morning in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. The sky was cloudless, so blue it felt like a promise. The old pine trees stood motionless in the sunlight, and the wind rolling down from the Grand Tetons was just strong enough to make the flags flutter atop the grandstand. Radford Arena was packed. Light-colored cowboy hats, anxious eyes, cheering voices, and a frenzy of betting buzzed together, creating a fevered rhythm that pulsed through the air. Calvin Radford sat in the private box reserved for investors and elites, his steely eyes locked on the track below. He wore a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, a gold watch glinting faintly in the sun. His angular face and firm jawline told the story of a man born to command, not to empathize. Onyx stood proudly at the starting gate, a jet-black Mustang stallion, dark as a moonless night. His body was lean and muscular, coat shimmering with health, and his eyes burned with unshakable fire. He had won 3 consecutive races in the past 2 months, thrusting Calvin Radford's name back into the top ranks of Western horse racing. But to Calvin, victory wasn't about glory. It was about dominance. His alone. "They're going to call me King of the Canyon after today," Calvin muttered, glancing sideways at Tucker Griggs, his ranch manager, who was nervously fiddling with the brim of his hat. "As long as Onyx holds his pace down the final stretch," Tucker replied, his eyes fixed on the horse's front legs, where an old tendon strain still lingered in the back of his mind. Calvin smirked. "If he doesn't, we replace him. Everything is replaceable." The starting horn sounded. Onyx launched forward like an arrow loosed from a taut bow. The thunder of hooves pounded the earth, dust flying in every direction. He surged ahead within half a lap, leaving behind 2 thoroughbreds from Texas and a quarter horse from Nevada. Calvin shot to his feet as Onyx approached the final turn. He knew, if the stallion held steady through that curve, the win was sealed. But that section of the track had been overwatered earlier that morning. One front hoof slipped, just barely. But it was enough. The sound of a stumble rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. Onyx's massive frame, over 1,000 pounds of muscle and bone, lurched, then collapsed in a violent thud. Gasps erupted from the stands. The jockey managed to leap off in time, tumbling into the dirt. But Onyx didn't move. Up in the box, Calvin didn't flinch. He didn't climb down. He just stood there, cold and still, his expression not that of a man watching a trusted companion fall, but of a businessman watching his stock crash. "Want me to call the vet?" Tucker asked quickly. "Do it. And ask how much the recovery's going to cost," Calvin replied flatly, hands buried in his pockets. 20 minutes later, the vet's report came in. Left front tendon injury, minimum of 8 months recovery, possible full healing but high risk of re-injury, Calvin sneered. 8 months? That's longer than most house campaigns last. Tucker swallowed hard. "So, do you want me to?" Calvin turned to him, his eyes stripped of all emotion. "Take him away, far. I don't want to see him again." Night was falling when Tucker drove the old pickup, trailer hitched behind, toward the edge of the Bridger-Teton forest. The dirt road was muddy, tires groaning under the weight. Inside the trailer, Onyx was silent. He didn't whimper or thrash. He simply lay still, his eyes wide open, memorizing everything. Tucker pulled into an empty clearing near a dry creek lined with weeping willows. He opened the trailer door. "Go on now. I'm sorry, you know that," he said softly, like a father trying to soothe a wounded child. Onyx stepped down, limping but upright. His back was straight, head held high. He looked at Tucker for a long time, then turned and walked slowly into the darkness. The truck rumbled away, red dust rising behind the taillights. Onyx stood frozen in the twilight, beneath a sky dimming into sorrow. The last rays of autumn's sun caught in his eyes, not with rage, not even pain, but with something far colder. The quiet, devastating knowledge that he had been left behind. At dawn, a thin veil of mist draped over the small valley at the edge of the Bridger-Teton National Forest, like a silver scarf. Robins chirped from the pine branches above, and the creek babbled softly through the rocks, humming the lullaby of the land. Josie Whitlow opened the wooden door of her cabin. Her brown hair was tousled beneath a worn olive knit cap. Wrapped in an old flannel shirt, she carried a metal pail and stepped down the dirt path toward the creek less than 100 yards away. At 21, Josie lived alone in what most people called the forgotten corner of Wyoming. The log cabin was the only thing her grandparents had left her. Her father, a railroad worker, died in an accident near the town of Lander 6 years earlier. Her mother disappeared shortly after, heading south without a single word. Josie refused to leave. She made a life growing herbs, tending chickens, gathering wild plants, selling eggs, sometimes bartering for supplies in Alpine, the nearest town a dozen miles away. Her closest friend was Hank, a black and tan coonhound who followed her everywhere like a second shadow. Then there was Marty, the lazy old pack mule who had once trudged through hunting seasons with her grandfather. That morning, as Josie bent to scoop water, Hank growled low in his throat. She looked up, hand frozen midair just above the creek's surface. Across the stream, near the hanging willows, a dark shape lay twisted on its side. Mist masked most of its body, but she saw it clearly. It was a horse, a large one, no movement, no sound. Josie slowly crossed the homemade footbridge, 2 old logs nailed together. Hank stayed close, still growling. Her scarf fluttered behind her like a quiet flag in the fog. As she drew near, the figure came into focus. A black horse, dust-matted along its flank. Its left front leg was swollen. It shivered, each breath labored with a rattling sound. Eyes wide open but cloudy, sharp with fear and drowning in despair. "Oh God," Josie whispered. She dropped to one knee, keeping a safe distance. Her eyes locked with its eyes, and something unspoken passed between them. Gently, she reached into her coat and pulled out a piece of hard bread. She extended it toward the horse. It looked at the offering, unmoving. "I won't hurt you," she said softly, her voice as calm as wind brushing through tall grass. "If they left you out here, then they never deserved you." For long minutes they remained still. Then finally, the horse inched forward, touched the bread with its nose, and took a slow, careful bite. Josie smiled. She pulled a rope from the small backpack on her shoulder, fashioned a simple lead. One hand held the line, the other stroked the horse's neck. Its tendons were pronounced, and old scars peeked through the thin coat. This wasn't a wild Mustang. It had once worn a saddle, been trained, cared for. But those eyes, they looked frozen over by betrayal. "Come with me. I don't have much, but I've got shelter and warm water." And so a new journey began. Josie led the horse down a back trail behind her cabin, steering clear of the highway where hunters on ATVs sometimes passed. The horse limped and wheezed with every breath, but it followed her. Hank trotted ahead, glancing back as if on patrol, while Marty peeked his sleepy head out of the barn and brayed loudly, as if asking, "What's going on now?" The old shed that used to shelter Marty during the cold season was cleaned out in a hurry. Josie laid down fresh straw, old blankets, and dry grass. She boiled water with wild sage and mountain ginger, remedies her grandmother once used, and wiped the horse clean with soft cloths. She didn't know much about veterinary medicine, but she knew what it felt like to be abandoned. And she understood what it meant to be given one more chance to trust. That night, she stayed beside the horse. Each time it trembled, she offered warm water. She whispered stories about winters past, about splitting wood for the first time, about the silence after her mother vanished. By morning, when the pale sunlight touched the cabin walls, the horse was asleep. Eyes closed, breathing steady. Hank lay by the stall door, and Josie had dozed off on a pile of straw, still holding the lead rope, like a lifeline between two hearts starting to mend. 3 days had passed since Josie brought the black horse back to her cabin. Autumn winds had started to pick up, maple leaves painting the ground red as they scattered across the worn wooden porch. In the early mornings, cold air crept through the cabin's cracks, a reminder that winter in the mountains was neither polite nor patient. The horse still rested in Marty's old shelter, now lined with thick straw and every scrap of blanket Josie could find. The swelling in its left front leg had gone down, though healing was far from complete. Each day, Josie cleaned the wound with arnica tea and wrapped it in warm, salt-soaked gauze. She massaged the tendons using almond oil mixed with eucalyptus, a folk remedy passed down from her grandmother, once used to ease her grandfather's stiff joints. Outside, Hank kept watch by the door, ears perked as he adjusted to this new rhythm of life. Marty, grumpy about losing his stall, had settled under the awning out back, where Josie had strung a tarp to shield him from the rain. On the fourth morning, as Josie carried in a pail of warm water and hay, the horse let out a soft, breathy nicker. Not loud, not strong, but full, like the first song of someone who'd been silent far too long. Josie froze, her hand still on the latch. In that moment, she didn't just hear a sound, she heard something real, not from the horse's throat, but from its heart. "Storm," she whispered. The horse tilted its head slightly as if asking her to say it again. "I'll call you Storm," she said, stepping closer. "Because you came like one. I don't know where from, but you didn't land here by accident. Just like everything else in my life, you showed up to change something." From that day forward, Onyx became a name left in the past. Storm was his new name, one that carried a different current. He was no longer just a discarded racehorse, but a symbol of something bigger: resilience, dignity, and the right to be loved. With each passing day, Josie helped Storm rise to his feet. At first, just for minutes at a time, using a soft cloth sling around his belly to steady his weight. She talked to him through every session, telling him about the maple tree she planted when she was 7, about the time she fell down the stairs and broke her arm but didn't cry, about the months when no one said her name after her mother left. Storm listened, or at least pretended to. His eyes followed her as she moved around the stall. Sometimes, when she laughed at something small, he'd toss his head like he was in on the joke. One afternoon, with golden light pouring across the hillside, Storm took a longer step than usual. Josie held her breath. Then another step. He stopped, trembling. She burst into tears, wrapped her arms around his neck. The smell of horse sweat and fresh straw mixed with the scent of herbal tea from the cabin. And in that moment, no one could say this forgotten corner of the world was empty. Because here, something sacred was coming back to life. The next morning, as Josie gathered eggs near the coop, an old moss-green Jeep rumbled up the drive. Out stepped Mrs. Eunice Dawson, 70 years old, carrying a basket of homemade bread. "You got eggs for me, sweetheart?" she called, tapping her cane against the porch steps. Josie smiled and opened the door. 12 of them, still warm. As Josie stepped inside to fetch the carton, Mrs. Eunice's eyes drifted across the yard until they landed on the horse stall. "What's that over there?" she asked. "Oh, a friend. He was hurt. I'm taking care of him." The old woman walked closer, her sharp eyes scanning the horse from thigh to shoulder to neck. "That's no ordinary horse," she muttered in her raspy but firm voice. Josie nodded. "I figured. But to me, he's Storm. That's all that matters." Mrs. Eunice gave an approving nod. "Well said. Not everyone would agree. But if you're the first one he's let eat from your hand, well, that horse is yours now." She didn't say anything else. But before getting back in the Jeep, she turned and added, "You should meet my grandson Kyle. He works at a horse rescue down in Utah. He could help you understand just how special that animal is." Josie thanked her and watched the Jeep disappear behind the pines. Storm poked his head out of the stall, chewing straw. The wind lifted his mane across his eyes and his ears twitched forward, like he, too, was listening. That night, moonlight stretched long shadows across the cabin floor. Josie sat at her small wooden table, journaling by lamplight. The ink in her bottle was running low, but she kept writing about Storm, about the first step he took, the first look they shared, and the feeling of being trusted by something so broken, yet still willing to try again. Outside, Hank was asleep. Marty grazed quietly in the dark. And Storm, the horse no one had wanted to keep, was breathing peacefully under a low-hung lantern, flickering like a lone star that refused to go out. A star, for both of them, in the middle of a long, quiet night. The first snow had already touched the gray peaks in the distance. Down in the Bridger-Teton Valley, the eastern wind began creeping through every mountain fold, slipping through cabin walls and howling in the long, cold nights. But for Josie and Storm, this winter felt unlike any before, because inside their small cabin, the fire still burned, and kindness, that rare thing no tax could touch, filled every corner. Storm had nearly fully recovered. He no longer limped as badly and had begun taking morning walks around the valley with Josie and Hank. Each step still held a hint of caution, but the cloudiness had lifted from his eyes. He looked at Josie with something soft, something trusting. As if he knew she was the last person on earth he could truly count on. One afternoon, Josie was pulling dry wood from the shed when a stranger rode up the old dirt road. He wore a long coat, a cowboy hat, and everything about him said, "He's not from around here." "Miss Whitlow," the man called, his voice deep and sharp. Josie stood upright, hand still holding an axe. Her eyes narrowed. Hank growled low, and even Storm, who was near the creek, lifted his head. "What do you want?" Josie called back, not moving closer. The man tipped his hat, revealing graying hair and a weathered face. Behind him was a younger man in glasses, clutching a briefcase. "My name's Tucker Griggs. I'm here on behalf of my employer, Mr. Calvin Radford." Josie's heart gave a hard beat, not out of fear, but because she'd known this moment would come, just not this soon. "We were informed that a black Mustang bearing resemblance to Mr. Radford's racehorse has been found on this property." Josie didn't answer. She walked toward the horse stall. Storm had already started to move closer, as if sensing something heavy was coming. "You understand," Tucker continued. Not aggressive, but firm. "Racehorses are registered property. Even if injured, that horse still legally belongs to Mr. Radford." Josie locked eyes with him. "He left that horse by the creek, at night, didn't even look back." The man with the briefcase cut in, his tone flat and practiced. "We have documentation proving that the horse was registered in the Wyoming racing system. If you refuse to return it, we will pursue legal avenues." Josie gave a small smile. It wasn't kind. "So you're planning to sue me for saving a life someone else threw away?" Tucker dismounted. His eyes softened slightly. "I know this isn't just about papers, but Mr. Radford doesn't take kindly to have property cared for by some nameless girl in the woods. And I don't take kindly to people treating living beings like throwaway tools," Josie replied, voice calm as early snow. "Storm, he's not yours anymore. The moment I gave him a name, he became family." Storm stood beside her, head lowered slightly, but his eyes didn't flinch. He didn't neigh, didn't back up, just stood there, like a monument. Tucker looked at the pair for a long moment, then gave a quiet nod. "We'll be back," he said, climbing onto his horse. "Mr. Radford won't walk away that easy." That night, the cabin was still. Josie sat by the fireplace, flame-light flickering across her cheeks. Storm lay outside the stall, head resting near the doorway, as if listening to her breath. She opened her notebook and wrote, "They'll come back, and next time they might bring the whole world. But Storm, I won't let anyone take you, not after you chose to stay." Outside, snowflakes began to fall, soft as feathers. They landed on the roof, Storm's mane, and on the hand of the young woman who kept writing. Wind howled through the pines like the prelude to a storm yet to come. Miles away, in a timber-framed mansion in Jackson Hole, Calvin Radford stood at the window, glass of bourbon in hand. He wore a white shirt, sleeves crisp. Outside, the world was painted in white. Tucker had returned and stood behind him, silent. "She say anything?" Calvin asked, not turning. "She wasn't afraid, sir." Calvin turned, setting the glass down. His eyes were sharp enough to slice through silence. "Then we'll teach her what it means to be afraid," he said, turning back to the snowy landscape. "This isn't over." The next morning, Josie was at the barn earlier than usual. Storm stood calmly by the fence, grazing. Hank ran circles in the snow like nothing had changed. She didn't know how long this fight would last or how far it would go, but she knew one thing: she wouldn't leave Storm to face it alone. And the look in his eyes, he had said that to her a long time ago. The morning air was crystal clear after the first snow. On the gentle hillside behind the cabin, patches of snow still clung to the earth, melting slowly under the sun. The wind still carried the chill of high-country winter, but it had lost its sharp bite. Storm stood atop the soft ground, head high, ears turned toward the chirping of early winter birds. His mane lifted in the breeze, catching glints of sunlight. Josie stood a few steps away, holding an old hay rake, watching him. But what stirred inside her wasn't about healing legs or steady steps. It was something deeper. Each movement Storm made now was a declaration of life, of will, of freedom. A voice called from down the trail, "Josie." She turned and saw Mrs. Eunice Dawson wrestling her old silver pickup up the uneven dirt road. In the passenger seat was Kyle, her grandson, a man in his mid-20s with messy blonde hair and a smile as warm as soil after spring rain. Josie walked down to meet them. Hank barked happily, running excited loops around the truck as if he recognized the visitors. "You heard what's going on, haven't you?" Eunice asked as she stepped out of the cab. Josie nodded, calm but steady. "I knew they wouldn't stop." Kyle crossed his arms, eyes resting on Storm for a moment before looking back at her. "You need a lawyer." "A lawyer?" Josie chuckled dryly. "I've got $30 in my bank account, Kyle." Eunice patted her shoulder. "You won't have to pay. I know someone. Tyler Boone, young animal rights attorney, used to practice in Denver. Just moved to Jackson. Graduated top of his class." Josie raised an eyebrow. "And what's so special about him?" Eunice grinned. "He once brought a goat into a courtroom to prove it was being abused." They all laughed, not because it was funny, but because of how Eunice said it. Like hope wrapped in dry humor, offered gently in a storm. The next day, Tyler Boone showed up in a weathered Jeep, wearing a denim jacket and a faded baseball cap. He had the look of someone who'd read too many case files and the kind of smile that knew when to stay quiet. Josie sat across from him at her small wooden table. Afternoon light spilled in through the cabin window. "This case is complicated," Tyler said after skimming the few documents Josie had, mostly handwritten notes and receipts for horse medicine. "You don't have legal ownership. They can claim Storm as lost property. If Calvin Radford pushes this, it could drag out for months." Josie's hands tightened into fists. "So I don't stand a chance?" Tyler studied her face, then shook his head. "You do. If we prove Radford abandoned the horse, that can void his claim. And you have another advantage. This town is behind you." She let out a breath, eyes lighting up. "So what do I do?" He smiled. "Hold your ground. Don't back down. I'll help you." In the days that followed, Storm became more than just a horse in recovery. He became a symbol. Kyle put together a short video showing Josie leading Storm through the snow-covered woods. The caption read, "One girl, one horse, and a billionaire trying to take back what he threw away." The video spread like wildfire through the Western horse community. People who'd known Onyx, Storm's former name, began recognizing him. Anonymous messages came in, some claiming Calvin had a history of discarding horses once they stopped turning profit. One night, Josie sat by the fire in the barn. Storm lay nearby, eyes half closed. She rested her hand on his neck. "I don't know how this ends," she whispered. "But I know I'm not letting go. No matter how much money they throw at us, no matter how many lawyers they bring, I won't let you go back to the place that gave up on you." Storm opened one eye, and almost instinctively, he pressed his head into her palm. In that moment, Josie believed anything was possible, as long as she stayed standing, as long as she didn't let fear take the lead. A week later, Kyle brought bad news. Calvin Radford filed a lawsuit. He's demanding Storm be returned within 7 days on grounds of unlawful possession of property. Josie fell silent. But Tyler stepped beside her, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. "Don't panic. We're not letting him win that easy." Josie nodded. "I've lost my father, my mother, and my childhood to this place. I'm not losing Storm too." Outside the barn, Storm stood beneath a gray sky, mane blowing in the wind. He didn't know about ownership laws or court orders or civil disputes. But he knew one thing: Josie was home, and the wind still blew from 2 directions. But this time, Josie wasn't standing alone. Winter came early that year. The Bridger-Teton mountain range lay beneath a pale white sheet, still and unforgiving, as if warning that something was coming. On a low ridge, nestled among the trees, Josie's cabin stood silent, but inside the air was strung tight as wire. Tyler spread the lawsuit documents across the table. "First hearing scheduled next week at the Jackson County Courthouse, but from what I've heard, Calvin Radford isn't planning to wait that long." Josie looked up. "What do you mean?" "He's coming here, in person. Could be tomorrow, maybe sooner." At sunrise the next day, before the mountains could even catch the light, the sound of tires crunching through snow echoed across the valley. Hank barked furiously. Marty stomped in his shelter, ears flicking with unease. Josie stepped outside, her coat drawn tight, breath curling in the cold air. A caravan of black vehicles rolled up the dirt path. At the lead, a gleaming Cadillac Escalade cutting through the mud and ice like it owned the world. The door opened. Calvin Radford stepped out. He wore a long cashmere coat, boots spotless despite the terrain. Behind him were 3 large men, silent and stone-faced. "Miss Whitlow," Calvin called out, his voice dry and metallic. I've come to reclaim my property. Josie tightened her leather gloves. Your property is in my yard, alive because of the compassion you abandoned. Calvin's brow lifted. Onyx is my racehorse. I have papers. I have witnesses. You're just a trespasser holding what doesn't belong to you. Tyler stepped forward, voice calm but cutting. And I'm her attorney. Everything you just said belongs in court, not at a girl's front door. Calvin glanced at Tyler, sneering like he'd spotted a bug on his sleeve. Courts take time. I don't intend to wait. He pulled out a document, a buyout contract. I'll pay 5 times market value. Sign it, hand over the lead rope, and we all walk away. Josie walked up slowly. Storm stood by the barn door, eyes scanning the body language like he understood every beat of the conversation. You think I'm keeping Storm for money? Josie asked, her voice astonishingly steady. I'm keeping him because no one else did. She took the contract, held it up, and tore it in half. Then again, and again, until the pieces fluttered like dying leaves in the snow. Calvin's face froze. One of the bodyguards, broad and inked to the wrist, stepped forward. Mr. Radford, we can. Calvin raised a hand, held him back. He stared at Josie for a long time, his voice dropping to a razor-sharp whisper. You think you can beat me? Josie took a breath, her gaze unwavering. No, but I can refuse to bow. And sometimes, that's enough. But the standoff wasn't over. Calvin turned, climbed back into his vehicle, but the message was clear. He wouldn't leave quietly. That night, Josie's cabin was more crowded than ever. People from Alpine came in droves. The corner store owner, the old sheep farmer, the school teacher, even the kids who had once stopped by just to see the horse. Eunice stood in the center, her cane in one hand, her voice steady. We're not just protecting a horse, she said. We're protecting our right to live with compassion. If Calvin takes Storm back, he takes away the reason this place matters. Silence. Then, a single pair of hands clapped, then 2. Then everyone stood. A boy, maybe 10 years old, stepped up to Josie. He handed her a small silver coin. I was saving up for a cowboy hat, he said, but I think you need it more. Josie pulled him into her arms. Her eyes burned, but her chest had never felt warmer. The next morning, an extraordinary scene unfolded outside the cabin. Over 20 people had gathered, lining the snowy trail. Some held signs, some held flags. Most simply stood, with eyes firm and shoulders squared. Tyler looked over at Josie, voice thick. Calvin's not just up against you now, he's up against all of us. Storm was led outside, tall and radiant under the winter sun. His coat shone like obsidian. He wasn't Onyx, discarded asset of a tycoon. He was Storm, a creature of hope, dignity, and unbroken spirit. Calvin didn't return that day. Perhaps he finally understood. There are battles that money can't win. And in the snow-covered valley, the wind blew once more, but this time not from 2 sides. It blew in one direction, carrying a message from the soul of Wyoming. Sometimes, doing the right thing doesn't mean winning. It just means never surrendering. Time passed like creek water over mountain stones, patient and persistent. Jackson Hole stepped into its 3rd spring since the day Calvin Radford turned his car around and left Josie Whitlow's small log cabin in silence. That winter had been the last that Storm was strong enough to run through snowdrifts. He no longer flew like he had in his prime, but he moved with the grace of something that had survived. Each step echoed not the thunder of a racehorse, but the quiet pride of a soul reclaimed by love. Josie stood outside the barn, watching him graze under the soft morning sun. Her hair had grown long and wine-tangled, and her eyes, though marked by sleepless nights, still held the light of someone who had come through the storm and refused to turn back. The cabin was no longer alone. Down the slope, a small area had been cleared and built into a horse rescue center. A hand-painted wooden sign hung over the entrance, Storm Sanctuary, where horses find themselves again. Below it, a sketched image showed a young woman and a horse, nose to nose, simple but profoundly tender. Locals called it the Valley of Trust. They told visitors about the girl who stood up to one of the richest men in the West, armed with no money, no lawyers at first, just an unshakable heart. Mrs. Eunice Dawson, now 82, still came by every Monday to check on the horses. She still barked orders and waved her cane, but her eyes softened every time she saw Storm resting beneath the old willow tree. That horse, she would say, might be the smartest I've ever met, not because he could race, because he knew who to trust. Kyle, Eunice's grandson, had moved back to Wyoming for good. He helped Josie manage the sanctuary, built new stalls, expanded the pasture, even put in a training ring. On weekends, kids from town came to learn how to care for horses, how to be patient, and how to listen to what isn't spoken aloud. Tyler Boone, the once volunteer lawyer, was now one of Josie's closest friends. No longer just a defender in court, he planted grapevines behind the cabin, brought her coffee in the mornings, and sat quietly when quiet was needed. One crisp morning in September, Storm lay beneath the willow tree, his head lifted, ears still alert to the sound of life. He was older now, back arched gently, legs stiffer, but he was still Storm. Never again Onyx. Josie sat down beside him. She didn't cry. She just placed a hand on his forehead and whispered, as she had the day they first met, "Your family. Always will be." Storm blinked slowly. Then, as if he understood, he rested his head against her chest, one last time. Afterward, the people of Alpine came with flowers. They laid bunches of wild grass around the place where Storm had last laid. They tied blue ribbons on the old wooden fence. No speeches, no trumpets. Just silence, thick with respect. The way mountains say goodbye to their own. Calvin Radford never returned. After the Storm incident, his name faded from the racing circuit. Investors stopped calling. 5 years later, his clean energy company was sold off to a Canadian firm. No one quite knew where he went or what became of him. He became a shadow in someone else's story. Josie, though, she stayed. In the Valley of Trust. An indie film crew once asked to interview her. She only smiled and said, "I'm no hero." The hero was the horse someone once called worthless. Years later, when streaks of gray ran through Josie's hair, children still came to sit on her porch, listening. She would tell them how she first found Storm by the creek, about the showdown with Calvin Radford, and how in the end, Storm rested his head in her lap, like that small cabin had always been home. And when she reached the end, she'd always say, "There was a horse someone threw away. A girl who had nothing but faith, and a wind from the valley that changed everything." The wind still blows across the Wyoming hills, not the wind of winter, not even the breeze of spring, but the kind of wind born from stories that never die. The wind of courage, the wind of mercy, the wind of freedom no rope can ever bind. And if you listen closely, really listen, you might hear the sound of hooves whispering, "I'm still here, free and loved." If you believe that a steadfast heart can change the fate of a soul once cast aside, just leave a simple comment. 0 or 1 is enough to let us know you're still here, walking this journey with us. And don't forget to subscribe to True Animal Stories so you won't miss the next heartwarming chapter between humans and their four-legged companions. Stories that remind us, kindness always finds its way back. See you in the next story.